A storm rages across the frozen hills of the English countryside, and at the gates of Wintermere Hall, a desperate young mother collapses in the snow, clutching her dying child. Inside, a man haunted by loss, the Marquis of Wintermere, opens his door to fate and to a love that could cost him everything. Between duty and desire, between past and redemption, two hearts will defy the world. But some secrets buried beneath the snow refuse to stay hidden. Prepare to be swept into a story of forbidden love, sacrifice, and second chances. Subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 hearts in this growing community, so we can keep bringing these timeless romances to life. Lake District, England. Winter of 1815. The wind howled like a living thing through the white wilderness, carrying with it the sorrow of a long and merciless winter. In a small cottage at the edge of the valley, Clara Evans bent over the frail figure of her son. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to faint embers, and her breath rose in soft clouds before her trembling lips. Samuel lay wrapped in a thin blanket, his small chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. His skin was pale, his lips tinged blue. Clara's fingers brushed the damp curls from his forehead, her heart tightening at the warmth of his fever. "Hold on, my darling," she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. "Mama is here. You must hold on." She rose slowly, her joints stiff from the cold, and crossed the room where frost crept along the window panes like delicate lace. Her last candle burned low. Outside, the storm raged with cruel indifference. The road that led to the village was buried beneath snow. No one would come. Clara sank to her knees beside the small table where a wooden cross rested among her few possessions, her hands clasped together in silent agony. "Dear Lord," she prayed in a voice barely audible, "I have nothing left to give. I ask not for myself, but for my child. If there is mercy in heaven, send us a miracle before it's too late." Her words vanished into the dark, carried away by the wind. Far from her cottage, through the endless drifts of snow, a carriage laboured up the hill. Inside sat George Pembroke, the Marquis of Wintermere, his jaw set against the cold, his eyes fixed on the swirling night. After years abroad, he was returning to the place he once called home, not out of desire, but of duty. Wintermere Hall had awaited his return like a tomb, filled with ghosts he had never learned to forgive. "Careful with the turn," he told his driver. "These roads are treacherous." But before the words could settle, a shadow appeared before the horses, a figure clutching something in her arms. The driver shouted, pulling the reins hard. The carriage lurched, the horses whinnied, and George was thrown forward. When the vehicle halted, he flung open the door and stepped into the storm. Snow bit his face like shards of glass. At first, he thought it was a mirage. A woman kneeling in the snow, her hair loose beneath a worn bonnet, holding what seemed to be a lifeless child. "Madam," he called out, rushing toward her, "are you hurt?" Clara looked up, startled, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Please," she gasped, "my boy, he is ill. We were trying to reach the village, but—" She could say no more. The cold stole her breath, her strength. The Marquis knelt beside her, his gloved hand pressing to the child's cheek. Samuel stirred faintly, his small body limp. "He's still breathing," George murmured. "We must get you both to shelter." "I cannot pay," Clara began, but he interrupted her gently. "Do not speak of payment. You'll come with me. Now." Before she could protest, he lifted the boy carefully into his arms. The warmth of the child's fragile weight struck something deep within him, a memory, a wound long buried. He turned to the driver. "To Wintermere Hall, at once." The carriage wheels groaned through the snow. Inside, Clara sat opposite the Marquis, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes darting between her child and the stranger who had rescued them. The flickering lantern cast golden light over his face, sharp, stern, and unexpectedly kind beneath the shadow of grief. She whispered almost to herself, "You are too generous, sir. I do not even know your name." He hesitated for a moment, then answered quietly, "George Pembroke, Marquis of Wintermere." Her lips parted in shock. "My lord." "You needn't thank me," he said, his voice low and weary. "It seems fate put us on the same road tonight." When the carriage finally reached the gates of Wintermere Hall, the vast house rose like a sleeping giant against the white hills. Clara had never seen anything so grand or so lonely. Candlelight glimmered in only a few windows, the rest swallowed by darkness. Servants rushed forward as the carriage stopped. George carried Samuel himself through the great doors, issuing swift commands. "Prepare a bed near the fire, hot water, blankets." His tone was commanding yet urgent, stripped of the indifference nobles usually wore like armor. Clara followed, her steps uncertain. The hall smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, echoing with the whisper of forgotten days. The Marquis turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with quiet gravity. "He will be safe here," he said softly, "and so will you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. "You have already done more than I could ever repay. You owe me nothing, Mrs. Evans." His voice deepened, almost tender. "Perhaps it is I who owed the world a kindness long delayed." She bowed her head, unable to speak. As Samuel was carried upstairs, she looked once more at the man who had appeared in her darkest hour, tall, solemn, his expression unreadable yet filled with something she could not name. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Wintermere Hall, a single flame had been rekindled, fragile, flickering, but alive. Dawn crept slowly over the Lake District, pale and hesitant, as though afraid to disturb the hush that had fallen upon Wintermere Hall. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of glistening white hills and frost-laden trees. The air was still, the kind of cold that made breath visible, a reminder of life's fragility and endurance. In a quiet chamber near the west wing, Clara Evans stirred from uneasy sleep. The linen sheets beneath her hands were softer than anything she had known, and the scent of beeswax polish and lavender filled the air. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The carved canopy above her, the heavy velvet curtains, the faint crackle of a fire, all belonged to a world so distant from her own that it felt like a dream. Then memory returned. The storm, the carriage, the man with eyes like steel, turned to silver by compassion. She sat up, alarmed, searching the room for her son. Samuel lay sleeping in the small bed beside hers, his face peaceful, his breathing even. His cheeks had regained a touch of color. A tear of relief escaped her and fell silently on her clasped hands. A gentle knock interrupted her prayer. A kind-faced woman entered, round and rosy, dressed in the uniform of a housekeeper. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Mrs. Cartwright. His lordship ordered that you and the boy be looked after properly. The doctor has been and gone. Says the lad only needs rest and broth." Clara rose at once, her bare feet finding the cold floor. "The Marquis, did he—" Mrs. Cartwright smiled knowingly. "He was the one who carried your boy upstairs. Stood by the bed till dawn, he did, then insisted on fetching the physician himself." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She pressed a hand to her chest as though to steady her heartbeat. "Please, thank him for me. I shall go to him myself if—" "Oh, no, my dear," the housekeeper said kindly. "He doesn't wish to disturb you this morning. His lordship has ways of keeping to himself." She gestured toward the tray she carried. "Now you must eat. There's porridge, bread, and tea." When Mrs. Cartwright left, Clara sat by the window and gazed at the world beyond. The snow glittered like powdered glass, and far below she saw the stables, the frozen lake, and the faint trails where horses had passed. Everything spoke of silence, of waiting. Later she ventured into the corridor. Her simple wool gown and mended shawl seemed out of place among the portraits and crystal sconces. She walked softly, afraid her footsteps might echo where once music must have lived. Downstairs, near the great hall, the fire burned in a hearth as tall as two men. She paused, marveling at the tapestries depicting hunts and battles, and at the air of melancholy that hung over everything. Even the light seemed cautious, filtering in through tall windows like a visitor uncertain of its welcome. When she turned, she found him standing at the threshold. George Pembroke, the Marquis of Wintermere, watched her quietly. He had changed from the night before. The snow no longer clung to his coat, and his dark hair, though still dishevelled, revealed streaks of brown and gold where the morning sun touched it. His expression was composed, but his eyes betrayed something softer, something unguarded. "Mrs. Evans," he said at last. His voice was low, shaped by years of command, yet tempered by an undercurrent of gentleness. "You are awake, I see." "Yes, my lord," she replied, lowering her gaze. "I wish to thank you for everything you did for my son." He took a few steps forward. "There is no need for thanks. I only did what any man of conscience would have done." Her eyes lifted to his. "Forgive me, but I do not believe that, my lord. Most men of means would not have stopped on that road. They would have turned their heads and left us to the snow." For a moment he said nothing. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with warmth neither dared claim. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "Perhaps once I might have done the same, but last night I could not." Clara hesitated. "Why?" His lips curved faintly, though the smile never reached his eyes. "Because it would have meant letting death win again." She did not understand his words, but the pain in them was unmistakable. The Marquis turned toward the fire, his profile cut sharp against the glow. "Your son will recover soon. You may remain here until he is well enough to travel. Mrs. Cartwright will see to your needs." Clara clasped her hands tightly. "You are most generous, my lord, but I do not wish to impose." "You do not impose," he said simply, still without looking at her. "Wintermere Hall has endured emptiness long enough. Perhaps it is time it remembered what kindness feels like." There was a silence, tender and uncertain, before Clara murmured, "You speak as though this house could feel." At last he looked at her. "Perhaps it can." Their gazes met, hers filled with gratitude and confusion, his shadowed by memories untold. For an instant, the distance between them vanished. Then, as though remembering himself, George inclined his head. "You should rest. The storm will keep us here for some days yet." He left her then, and the echo of his footsteps faded down the corridor, but the warmth of his voice lingered, mingling with the faint scent of smoke and pine. That evening, Clara sat by the fire in the same room where she had first spoken to him. Samuel, now awake and hungry, was devouring the bowl of soup Mrs. Cartwright had brought. His laughter filled the air like music, and the servants smiled as they passed, whispering that the hall hadn't sounded so alive in years. When Samuel had fallen asleep again, Clara walked to the window and drew back the curtain. The snow had ceased. The moon lay low over the hills, silvering the rooftops and frozen lake. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. She did not hear him enter. "Mrs. Evans," said the Marquis softly behind her. She turned, startled, and instinctively curtsied. "My lord, forgive me, I did not hear—" "You are not expected to curtsy in my own house," he interrupted gently, almost amused. "I thought it proper," she said. "Proper," he repeated with quiet irony. "This house has known far too much propriety." He stepped closer, not enough to alarm her, but enough for her to notice the faint scent of cedar and winter air in his coat. The firelight painted his face in bronze and shadow. "Your son sleeps?" "Yes," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "thanks to your care." His eyes softened. "It was not care, Mrs. Evans. It was mercy, a mercy I could not give once before." Something in his tone made her heart twist. "You lost someone?" He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Yes, long ago. And since that day this house has been silent." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to ask more, to reach through the invisible barrier between them, but his gaze stopped her. It was not cold, it was wounded. "I do not wish to burden you with my sorrows," he said quietly. "You have enough of your own." "Perhaps," she replied softly. But sometimes two sorrows placed together weigh less than one. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. George looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, the loneliness in his eyes flickered with life. "Mrs. Evans," he murmured, "you speak with great wisdom. I only speak what I have learned through loss." He smiled faintly. "Then loss has made you stronger." "No, my lord," she said. "It has made me gentler." Their words hung in the air like the echo of a confession. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell. "Good night, Mrs. Evans. Rest well, and thank you for speaking to me as if I was still a man, not merely a title." Clara curtsied once more, though this time her heart was no longer bound by formality. "Good night, my lord." When he left, she stood by the fire a long while, her hands pressed together against the sudden trembling in her chest. Outside, the wind stirred again, not with fury, but like a whisper of change. In his own chamber, George Pembroke sat by the dying fire, his thoughts restless. For years he had avoided company, choosing silence over compassion, solitude over the risk of caring. Yet now, in the space of a single day, a woman of no rank and a child not his own had filled his home with warmth, and his heart with unease. He rose and walked to the window. Across the courtyard, he could see the faint glow of the fire in the room where Clara slept. It flickered against the glass like a living thing. He watched it, as one might watch hope itself, distant, fragile, and impossibly beautiful. Clara, too, lay awake. The events of the day played over in her mind. The Marquis's voice, the sorrow in his words, the unexpected tenderness behind his reserve. She could still feel the warmth of his gaze when he had said, "This house has known far too much propriety." She did not understand why those words lingered, but they did, like the memory of a touch never given. As the night deepened and the snow began to fall once more, both hearts remained awake in their separate rooms, bound by the same silence, the same loneliness, and a feeling neither dared to name. Wintermere Hall slept, but for the first time in years it dreamed. The days that followed were marked by a fragile peace that settled like mist over Wintermere Hall. The snow outside lay heavy upon the hills, and the lake had turned to glass beneath the pale sun. The servants moved quietly through the corridors, aware that something unseen, yet profound, had begun to stir within those ancient walls. For Clara Evans, each morning felt like awakening in another world. The creak of polished floors, the whisper of gowns, the soft chiming of distant clocks, all belonged to a life far removed from her own. She had lived simply for years, measuring her days by the toll of the school bell and the hum of village children's laughter. Now, surrounded by grandeur and silence, she often felt both humbled and out of place. Yet there was kindness, too. Mrs. Cartwright watched over her with gentle affection, ensuring she and Samuel lacked nothing. The boy, now fully recovered, had become the quiet joy of the household. He wandered the halls with wide eyes, leaving small traces of laughter wherever he went. Even the stern footman had begun to smile when Samuel passed by. And though George Pembroke, the Marquis of Wintermere, maintained his reserved manner, there was an undeniable change in him as well. Clara noticed it in the way his steps slowed when he crossed the hall where she sat, reading to Samuel, or how his gaze softened when he heard her singing softly by the fire. He seldom spoke at length, yet when he did, his words carried the weight of sincerity and the ache of something unspoken. On one particular afternoon, the snow began to fall again, gently this time, like a promise whispered by the sky. The household busied itself with small tasks, while the Marquis retreated to his study, as was his custom. Clara, restless and curious, decided to explore a little beyond the rooms she had come to know. She walked softly through the corridors, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, the air faintly scented with polish and pine. The house seemed endless, a labyrinth of history preserved in velvet and oak. The portraits on the walls watched her with solemn eyes, their painted gazes following her every step. Men in powdered wigs, women in silks and jewels, children in white lace, generations of Pembrokes frozen in oil and shadow. When she reached the upper gallery, the light had begun to fade. Dust motes danced in the last golden rays filtering through the tall, arched windows. Then at the end of the long corridor, she saw it. A grand painting, larger than all the rest. The portrait depicted a woman of striking beauty. Her hair, a cascade of dark curls, framed a face both serene and sorrowful. She wore a pale gown embroidered with pearls, and in her hands she held a single white rose. Behind her stretched a background of stormy skies and wild sea cliffs. So vivid, it seemed alive. Clara felt her breath catch. She did not need to ask whose portrait it was. The resemblance between the painted woman and the shadow that haunted the Marquis's eyes was unmistakable. She stepped closer, her fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the ornate frame. "So this is the woman he loved," she murmured softly, as though speaking to herself. "Indeed," came a voice behind her, low and steady. "It is." Clara turned sharply. George Pembroke stood in the doorway, his figure outlined against the dimming light. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those grey eyes so full of restraint, burned with something deeper, almost painful. "My lord," she said quickly, stepping back. "Forgive me. I should not have come here without permission." He walked toward her, slow and deliberate. "You are free to walk wherever you wish. This house has nothing to hide. Though it holds much, I would rather forget." Clara lowered her gaze. She was very beautiful. He stopped beside her, his eyes fixed on the portrait. Yes, and she was kind, perhaps too kind for this world. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind outside sighed against the windows, and the faint glow of the setting sun lit the painted woman's face as though she were breathing once more. "I was told," Clara said quietly, "that she passed away long ago." 10 years, he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. 10 long years. The pain in his tone pierced her. "I am sorry," she said, and the words came from the heart. "No one should carry sorrow for so long alone." He turned to her then, his gaze sharp yet softened by fatigue. "Grief is a strange companion, Mrs. Evans. At first it is unbearable, and later it becomes part of you. You learn to walk with it, to eat with it, to sleep beside it, until one day you no longer know who you are without it." Her throat tightened. "And yet you go on." "I exist," he said simply. "That is not the same as living." Clara studied his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, the way his jaw clenched as though holding back words he could not allow himself to speak. "Perhaps, my lord," she said softly, "you have lived too long among ghosts." He looked at her sharply, but there was no anger in his expression, only surprise. "And you, Mrs. Evans, do you not believe in ghosts?" She smiled faintly. "I believe the past lingers, where love was strong enough to leave its mark. But I also believe the living deserve peace." For a moment, silence stretched between them, delicate and fragile as spun glass. Then George exhaled, his voice low and raw. "There are rooms in this house I have not entered in years. Her music room, her garden, this gallery. Every corner of it reminds me of her. I thought that by locking the doors, I could lock away the pain." "And did it work?" she asked gently. "No," he said after a pause. "The pain simply learned to wait." Clara's heart ached for him. She wanted to offer comfort, but propriety bound her hands. Still, something in her gaze, warm, compassionate, unafraid, seemed to reach him in a way no words could. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the faint heat of his breath in the chill air. "Mrs. Evans," he murmured, "you should not have come here. This place, it awakens things best left buried." "Sometimes," she replied softly, "we must face the shadows before we can see the light again." He stared at her, torn between retreat and surrender. His eyes moved from hers to the gentle curve of her mouth, then back again, as if searching for something he had lost long ago. "You speak as though you understand." "I do," she whispered. "I have known loss too, and loneliness. They change a person, my lord, but they need not destroy what is left." Her words settled over him like snow, silent, pure, and disarming. He turned his gaze back to the portrait, and for the first time he looked at it not with bitterness, but with longing tempered by acceptance. "She loved the sea," he said quietly. "I painted it behind her because she said it reminded her of freedom. I promised to take her to Cornwall one summer, but she fell ill before we could go. I never made her that journey." Clara's eyes filled with tenderness. "Then take her there in your heart, my lord. Let her rest, knowing you remember her with gentleness, not grief." He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. "You speak with the wisdom of a saint." "I am no saint," she replied. "Only a woman who prays to be strong enough for her child, and brave enough to forgive the past." The silence that followed was charged, alive with a tension neither could name. The firelight flickered across their faces, painting her in warmth and him in shadow. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless. At last George spoke again, his voice unsteady. "Tell me, Mrs. Evans, do you find this house lonely?" She hesitated. "Yes, my lord, but loneliness can be less cruel when shared." He smiled faintly, the first true smile she had seen from him. It softened his whole face, making him seem younger, almost boyish beneath the weight of his title. "You are very brave to speak so freely to a marquis." "Perhaps," she said with quiet humour, "because I see no marquis before me now, only a man who longs to be forgiven." His breath caught, and for a heartbeat she feared she had gone too far. But instead of rebuking her, he looked away, his expression raw with emotion. "You see too much, Mrs. Evans." "I see only what you allow," she answered. A long pause followed. The moment balanced between them, fragile as a heartbeat, before George stepped back. "It grows late," he said softly. "You should return to your rooms." Clara inclined her head. "As you wish, my lord." As she turned to leave, he spoke once more, his voice almost a whisper. "Mrs. Evans, thank you. You have done more good in this house than you could imagine." She paused in the doorway, her heart fluttering. "Then I am grateful to have done some small kindness where it was needed." When she was gone, George remained alone before the portrait. The painted woman looked down upon him as she always had, serene, untouchable. But tonight, something was different. The ache in his chest was still there, yet beneath it stirred a faint warmth, a fragile spark of life returning to a heart long frozen. And far down the hall, as Clara walked back toward her room, her own heart trembled in quiet confusion. She told herself it was pity she felt, sympathy for a man broken by grief, but deep inside, she knew it was something far more dangerous. That night, Wintermere Hall slept beneath a curtain of snow, but within its ancient walls, two hearts had awakened, one from sorrow, the other from fear, both touched by the first glimmer of something neither dared name. The following days unfolded beneath a fragile truce between sunlight and snow. The winter sky above Wintermere Hall remained pale and uncertain, as though the heavens themselves were still deciding whether to bless or punish the world below. Inside, fires burned in every hearth, chasing away the cold, yet doing little to dispel the quiet tension that now lived between Clara Evans and George Pembroke. Something unspoken had passed between them in the portrait gallery. A spark neither of them had intended, but both carried now like a secret flame. Each glance held weight, each conversation felt threaded with something that hovered just beyond words. The air seemed charged with awareness, of his gaze following her as she moved through the drawing room, of her voice softening when she spoke to him, of silences that lingered too long to be accidental. And yet, propriety was a fortress neither dared breach. For every tender word, there was a wall of class and duty between them, centuries of rules that whispered, no further. That morning Clara awoke early. The house still slept, and only the faint light of dawn filtered through her window. She wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped into the corridor, drawn by the hush of the sleeping mansion. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the main staircase, where frost glimmered like powdered sugar upon the tall windows. Below, she saw movement. The Marquis himself, already awake, standing near the great hearth of the entrance hall. He was dressed for the day in a dark green coat that deepened the colour of his eyes, and he seemed absorbed in thought, a letter open in his hands. Clara hesitated, uncertain whether to approach, but before she could withdraw, he looked up. Their eyes met, and something gentle but unyielding passed between them. "Mrs. Evans," he said quietly, "you rise early." "I could not sleep," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The house feels different when all is still." He folded the letter with deliberate care. "Yes, it is almost peaceful at this hour. The noise of the world has not yet found its way in." She stepped closer, drawn by the warmth of the fire and by the calm in his voice. "Forgive me, my lord. I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," he said, and for a moment the formality of his tone softened. "In truth, I find your company far less intrusive than most who have crossed this threshold." Her heart gave a small, nervous tremor. "Then I am honored, my lord." He studied her for a moment, his gaze tracing the curve of her face in the amber glow. "Tell me, Mrs. Evans," he said after a pause, "do you ever miss the village?" She smiled faintly. "Sometimes. The children's laughter, the scent of bread from the baker's oven, the ordinary rhythm of small lives. There is comfort in simplicity." "Comfort," he echoed almost wistfully. "A luxury many of us cannot afford." She tilted her head. "You speak as though wealth were a prison." He gave a quiet, mirthless laugh. "And what else is it if not a cage lined with gold? The nobility are not free, Mrs. Evans. Every step, every word, every gesture is measured and weighed. Duty is a crown that grows heavier with time." Clara looked at him thoughtfully. Yet duty, when guided by kindness, can also be noble. He turned toward the fire, his expression darkening. "Kindness has no place in a world that values blood over virtue. I once believed I could live differently, but the world corrected me." She sensed the shadow in his voice and chose her words carefully. Perhaps the world was wrong. He glanced at her sharply, surprised by her boldness, but her gaze did not waver. There was something in her calm defiance that both unsettled and fascinated him. Before he could reply, Samuel's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs, bright and innocent. Clara's face softened instantly. "He sounds better every day," George remarked, his tone easing. "Yes," she said, her smile faint but radiant. "You have given him warmth and safety, things I feared I could no longer provide." His eyes lingered on her face, and for the first time he allowed the truth to slip through his defenses. "Perhaps he has given me something in return." Their gazes held, and the silence that followed was alive, charged with emotion neither dared name. Later that afternoon, Clara and Samuel joined the Marquis for tea in the drawing-room at his invitation. It was a simple gesture, but one that caused whispers among the staff. The boy sat eagerly beside the fire, speaking with the bright candor of a child, while George listened with a patience that surprised even himself. Clara observed them quietly, her heart stirring at the sight of the powerful man leaning forward to hear her son's stories about imaginary castles and winter fairies. At one point, Samuel asked innocently, "My lord, do you live here all alone?" George hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I suppose I do, though I had not realized how quiet that was until recently." "Then you should have more people," Samuel said earnestly. "Mamma says laughter keeps a house warm." Clara blushed. "Samuel, that's enough." But the Marquis laughed softly, a sound rare and low, like the echo of forgotten happiness. "Your mother is a very wise woman." When Samuel was taken upstairs to rest, Clara lingered by the fire, uncertain whether to leave. George stood near the mantel, his posture relaxed, yet his eyes distant. "Your son is remarkable," he said quietly. "There is light in him. He reminds me of the boy I once was before—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Before life became complicated," Clara finished gently. Yes. She approached the window, gazing at the falling snow. Complication seems to be the price of growing older. We learn too much of sorrow and forget how to hope. He turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. And yet you still hope, Mrs. Evans. I can see it in your eyes. I must, she said. Hope is all that has carried me this far. He studied her in silence, the firelight dancing across his features. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her. Admiration, perhaps, or longing restrained by the armor of class and duty. Tell me, he asked softly, do you ever grow weary of being strong? She looked down, her voice barely audible. Every day. But weakness is a luxury I cannot afford. Their eyes met again, and the world seemed to narrow to that single moment. The warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of their breaths, the delicate pull of a bond neither had sought. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. My lord, I fear I have spoken too freely. On the contrary, he said, stepping closer, his tone low and sincere, it has been too long since anyone spoke to me with truth instead of flattery. Her pulse quickened. You mistake honesty for boldness. Perhaps boldness is exactly what I need. The words hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. For a heartbeat, she thought he might reach for her hand, and she knew without doubt that she would not have pulled away. But he only exhaled, his jaw tightening as reason overcame impulse. Forgive me, he murmured, retreating a step. I forget myself. Clara's cheeks flushed, though her voice remained steady. There is nothing to forgive, my lord. When she left the room, her heart was beating so fast she could scarcely breathe. Upstairs, in the solitude of her chamber, she pressed a trembling hand to her chest, bewildered by what she felt. Gratitude, respect, admiration, and something else she dared not name. Meanwhile, George stood alone by the fire, staring into the flames, as though seeking absolution. He could still smell her presence in the room. Lavender, faint smoke, something purely her. For the first time in years, he found himself at war with the very principles that had once defined him. That night, Clara found sleep elusive. Through the window, she saw the lights of the great house still burning in the west wing, where she knew the Marquis's study lay. She wondered if he too was awake, pacing beneath the same restless thoughts. And indeed he was. George walked the length of his study, his hands clasped behind his back, every step echoing with conflict. The memory of her eyes, the warmth of her voice, the gentle courage in her every word. They followed him like a haunting. Fool, he muttered to himself. She is not of your world. Yet even as he spoke, his heart whispered another truth, that for the first time in years, he felt alive. Down the hall, Clara sat by the window, watching as the snow thickened outside. The world lay silent and pure, untouched. She thought of her late husband, of the long years of solitude that had followed, and of the strange new stirrings that now filled her chest. Do not dream, Clara, she whispered to herself. You know where dreams lead. But as she closed her eyes, she saw again the Marquis's face, illuminated by the fire, not as a man of title, but as a soul just as lost and yearning as her own. Somewhere deep within Wintermere Hall, the great clock struck midnight. The sound carried through the sleeping corridors, solemn and tender, like the heartbeat of a house awakening to the quiet miracle of love. The snow had fallen without pause for 3 days, wrapping Wintermere Hall in a white silence that seemed almost sacred. Every tree stood heavy with frost, every rooftop glimmered beneath a pale December sun, and the lake lay hidden beneath a smooth mirror of ice. The servants whispered that it was the heaviest snowfall in years, but there was a strange sweetness to it, as if even nature longed for beauty after too much sorrow. Inside the great house, preparations had begun for something that had not happened in nearly a decade, a Christmas celebration. It had been Mrs. Cartwright's idea, though she claimed it had come from little Samuel Evans. The boy only asked if there would be a tree, she had told the Marquis, her eyes twinkling. But perhaps the hall could use a bit of cheer again. To everyone's surprise, George Pembroke, the Marquis of Wintermere, had agreed. "Very well," he had said, in that quiet, measured tone of his. "If Christmas is to be endured, let it be endured properly." But when he said the words, his gaze had lingered on Clara Evans, who had stood in the corner of the drawing-room, her hands clasped before her apron, her cheeks touched by the glow of the firelight. She had lowered her eyes at once, though her heart had leapt in her chest. For the first time, the idea of Christmas did not feel like a distant dream. It felt like something warm and near. And so Wintermere Hall awoke from its long mourning. Garlands of evergreen and holly were hung along the banisters. The kitchen buzzed with activity as sweet spices perfumed the air. Candles were polished, music rehearsed, and laughter, true laughter, echoed through the corridors. The servants could hardly believe it. "Imagine," one footman said, shaking his head, "a Christmas ball again, after all these years." Yet none felt the tremor of anticipation more deeply than Clara. The days leading to Christmas Eve were a whirlwind of preparation. Though she told herself she merely wished to help, she found herself lingering near the rooms where the Marquis passed, in the library where he discussed arrangements with his steward, in the hall where he tested the piano's keys with a wistful touch, recalling melodies long forgotten. Every accidental glance between them seemed to hold a conversation unspoken. Every silence felt charged with meaning. On the morning of the ball, the sky was a soft, silver grey. Clara stood by her window, watching snowflakes drift lazily over the valley. She could hardly believe that tonight she would stand in the grand ballroom, the same place where years ago nobility had waltzed beneath crystal chandeliers, while she, a young schoolteacher, had been a stranger outside those gates. Mrs. Cartwright entered with a small bundle of folded fabric. "This is for you, my dear," she said warmly. Clara turned, startled. "For me?" The housekeeper smiled. "It belonged to one of the late Marchioness's maids. I thought it might suit you, with a few alterations." When Clara unfolded the dress, her breath caught. It was simple but elegant. Soft cream muslin trimmed with lace, its waist gathered just below the bust, the skirt flowing like candlelight. "Oh, Mrs. Cartwright," she whispered, "I cannot possibly—" "You can and you will," the woman insisted gently. "The Marquis himself would have it so. He said no guest should feel like a stranger tonight." Clara's heart quickened. The Marquis had thought of her. The realization both warmed and unsettled her. By evening, Wintermere Hall was transformed. The chandeliers blazed with light, the air shimmered with the scent of pine and polished silver, and a small orchestra filled the ballroom with lilting violins. Guests from nearby estates arrived in carriages dusted with snow, landowners, widows, and gentlemen of the county, all eager to witness the long-forgotten grandeur of Wintermere restored. Clara stood near the edge of the ballroom, her hands trembling slightly against her gown. She had tied her hair in a loose twist, leaving a few curls to frame her face, and the candlelight turned them to strands of gold. She felt painfully aware of her plain shoes, her modest posture, her lack of jewels. But when she saw Samuel laughing near the Christmas tree and the Marquis standing tall beside him, her anxiety eased. George Pembroke cut a commanding figure that night. Dressed in a black tailcoat and crisp white cravat, he moved through the crowd with quiet grace. Though the guests greeted him with admiration and curiosity, his attention wandered constantly, searching, though he would not admit for whom. When his gaze finally found her, he froze. Clara stood near the window, half-bathed in the silver light of the moon. The simplicity of her gown made her more striking than any lady there. Something inside him stirred, not sudden but deep and certain, as though he had been waiting for this moment far longer than he knew. He crossed the room, ignoring the murmured greetings around him, and stopped a few steps away. "Mrs. Evans," he said softly. "You look—" His voice faltered. "The word I am searching for escapes me." She lowered her eyes, her cheeks warming. "You are too kind, my lord." "Kindness," he said, "has nothing to do with truth." For a heartbeat neither moved. Then, as the orchestra began a slow waltz, he extended his hand. "Will you grant me this dance?" Clara hesitated. "My lord, I am not. I have never learned." "Then allow me to teach you." He said it not as command, but as promise. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their palms touched, she felt the strength and warmth of him. They stepped onto the floor. The music rose, tender and haunting. George guided her gently, his hand at her back, his touch steady. At first her movements were uncertain, but he whispered, "Do not count the steps. Listen to the rhythm instead." And she did. Slowly the world around them began to fade. The laughter, the whispers, the light, all dissolved into the space between them. Her heartbeat matched the music. His gaze held hers like gravity. "You move beautifully," he said, though his voice was almost unsteady. "I move because you guide me," she replied. He smiled then, the kind of smile that broke through the coldest of walls. "You make it seem as though I were capable of miracles." "Perhaps," she murmured. "You are." The dance drew to an end, but neither released the other immediately. Only when the final note faded did George step back, bowing slightly. "Mrs. Evans, you have honored me, and you have shown me kindness beyond measure," she said softly. "Tonight I will remember that happiness can still find those who have stopped believing in it." For a long moment they simply looked at each other, two hearts suspended between the past and what could never be. Later, as the evening waned and snow began to fall anew, Clara stood alone on the terrace to catch her breath. The air was cold, the sky glittering with stars. She wrapped her shawl tighter, her pulse still fluttering from the dance. Behind her she heard the sound of footsteps. "You should not be out in the cold," George said quietly. His voice was lower now, almost tender. She turned, smiling faintly. "I needed a moment to breathe. The beauty of it all. It feels almost unreal." He looked at her with something more than admiration. "You have given this house life again, Mrs. Evans. You may not see it, but everyone feels it. The laughter of your child, your grace in every room. Wintermere owes you more than you can imagine." Her breath caught. "Please, my lord, do not say such things. I am here only by your mercy." "You call it mercy," he said, stepping closer, "but I call it fate." She trembled, though not from the cold. His eyes held hers with quiet intensity, and the night seemed to shrink around them. "My lord," she whispered, "this cannot—" He shook his head gently. "I know what you wish to say, and yet, for one moment, allow me to forget the world as it is." His gloved hand brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. The gesture was barely more than a breath, yet it made her heart ache. The tension between them felt almost sacred, a closeness forbidden, yet inevitable. "Tell me," he said softly, "have you ever known peace, Mrs. Evans?" She hesitated, her voice trembling. "Not until now." Their words faded into silence. Snowflakes drifted between them, melting upon their skin like whispers of confession. And though no kiss passed between them, the air was filled with something far more intimate. The promise of love, born not from passion alone, but from the shared ache of two souls finding warmth in each other's company. Inside, the orchestra began another waltz, its melody faint through the doors. George took a slow step back, his expression shadowed by restraint. "Forgive me," he said, his voice unsteady. "I forget myself again." "There is nothing to forgive," she replied, though her heart said otherwise. He inclined his head. "Good night, Mrs. Evans." "Good night, my lord." When she returned inside, the candles had burned low, and the guests were beginning to leave. Yet Clara knew she would carry the memory of that night, the waltz, his gaze, the quiet miracle of being seen, for the rest of her life. And as the great clock struck midnight, somewhere deep within Wintermere Hall, both hearts whispered the same truth in silence, that love, once awakened, can no longer be contained. The dawn after the Christmas ball broke pale and uncertain, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to disturb the quiet that lingered over Wintermere Hall. A faint mist veiled the valley, softening the outlines of the frozen lake and the distant pines. The echo of music still seemed to hang in the air, the violins, the murmured laughter, the unspoken confessions. Yet within the great house, the spell of that night had already begun to fade into a fragile memory. Clara Evans awoke before sunrise, her heart still fluttering with the ghost of the waltz. She lay still, watching the faint light creep through the heavy curtains, unwilling to open her eyes fully to the day that would surely return her to reason. Her mind replayed the Marquis's voice, the warmth of his hand guiding hers, the way his gaze had seemed to hold her in a silence more intimate than words. She rose and crossed to the small window. The world outside was white and still, as if paused between one breath and the next. She pressed her fingers to the cold glass. It was only a dance, she whispered to herself. Nothing more. And yet her heart refused to believe it. Downstairs, George Pembroke, the Marquis of Wintermere, stood by the fire in his study, still wearing the same waistcoat from the night before, his cravat loosened. He had not slept. The memory of Clara's eyes beneath the chandeliers haunted him, that look of shy wonder and something deeper, something he dared not name. He poured a glass of brandy, though the hour was early, and stared into the flames. For years, his life had been governed by silence, by the cold decorum demanded of a man of his rank. But now, that carefully constructed stillness had been broken, and by a woman whose gentleness had undone him more completely than any battle of reason could. When the butler entered bowing, George straightened at once. "There is a carriage approaching from the South Road, my lord," the man said. "It bears your family crest." George's hand tightened around the glass. "My mother," he murmured. The butler nodded. "Indeed, my lord, the Dowager Marchioness." For a long moment George said nothing. Then he set the glass aside, his expression composed, his tone cool. "Have her rooms prepared, and tell Mrs. Cartwright to see that breakfast is served in the east parlour." "Yes, my lord." When the servant had gone, George turned back to the fire, but the warmth no longer comforted him. The peace that had briefly filled the house would not survive his mother's arrival. He knew that with grim certainty. By mid-morning, the sound of horses and wheels echoed through the courtyard. Clara, standing by the window of the schoolroom with Samuel, saw the dark carriage sweep beneath the arch and felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. "Who is it, Mamma?" Samuel asked, peering over the sill. "I do not know, my darling," she replied, though her heart already sensed that whoever had come would bring change. The doors opened with the authority of old wealth. Lady Eleanor Pembroke, the Dowager Marchioness, stepped inside, her figure straight and proud despite her age. Her travelling cloak was trimmed with fur, her gloves spotless, her every movement as precise as a well-rehearsed command. Her eyes, sharp, pale and assessing, took in the restored grandeur of the hall before settling on her son, who waited to greet her. "George," she said, her tone crisp but not unkind. "So it is true. You have resurrected this mausoleum at last." He inclined his head. It seemed time. Her gaze softened briefly. "Your father would be proud." "I doubt that," he said quietly. The Dowager removed her gloves with slow deliberation. "I was told, in London, that you had guests. A widow and her child." George met her eyes. "They were stranded during the storm. It would have been inhuman to turn them away." "Humanity," Lady Eleanor said, her tone cool as frost, "has never been lacking in this family. Judgment, however, sometimes has." He drew a breath, steadying his voice. "They are under my protection, Mother. I would ask that you treat them with respect." "Of course," she said smoothly, but there was something in her smile that made his heart sink. "I am only curious to meet this woman who has awakened your charitable impulses." When Clara was summoned to the parlour later that morning, she went with trembling hands. Mrs. Cartwright offered her a reassuring glance, but Clara felt the weight of invisible eyes even before she entered. The Dowager stood near the fireplace, her bearing regal, her dress a deep plum velvet that caught the light like wine. Clara curtsied. "My lady." Lady Eleanor regarded her in silence for a moment. "So, you are Mrs. Evans?" Yes, my lady, I am deeply grateful for the hospitality your son has extended to me and my boy. Indeed, the dowager replied, her voice smooth but distant. It seems my son has taken great pains to ensure your comfort. Clara bowed her head. He has been most kind. Kindness, Lady Eleanor said, is a quality that too often leads men into imprudence. The word struck like a blade wrapped in velvet. Clara's cheeks burned, but she remained composed. If my presence has caused any inconvenience, I will take my leave as soon as my child is strong enough to travel. Before the dowager could reply, George entered. Mother, he said firmly, that will not be necessary. Mrs. Evans and her son are guests here. They will remain as long as I wish it. Lady Eleanor's expression did not change, but her eyes flashed with disapproval. As you wish, my son. When Clara withdrew moments later, she felt her composure unravel the moment the door closed behind her. Her heart pounded painfully. It was clear that she did not belong, not in this world of silk and marble, not beside a man whose very name carried centuries of power. That evening, as snow began to fall once more, she sat by Samuel's bedside, pretending to sew while her mind raced. The Marquis's mother had arrived like a storm within a storm, and Clara knew instinctively that her presence would change everything. A soft knock startled her. She turned, and there stood George himself, the lamplight behind him casting his face in gold and shadow. "Forgive me," he said. "I wish to see how Samuel fares." "He is well," Clara answered, rising to her feet. "He slept through the afternoon." Their eyes met, and the tension that had simmered since morning returned, sharper now, more fragile. "My mother can be difficult," he said at last. "She has lived too long by rules that no longer serve anyone. She is protecting what she values," Clara said gently. "A mother's heart cannot help but guard her son." He smiled faintly. "You always find grace, even where others would find insult." Clara hesitated, then spoke with quiet resolve. "Perhaps because I have learned that bitterness poisons only the one who carries it." He stepped closer, his voice softening. "You astonish me, Mrs. Evans." Her breath quickened. "You give me too much credit, my lord." "No," he said, "not enough." For a heartbeat, they stood close enough that the air between them seemed to shimmer. His gaze dropped to her hands, clasped nervously before her, and he had to resist the urge to take them in his own. "Do not let her frighten you," he murmured. "You belong here more than you think." Her eyes widened. "You must not say that, and yet I cannot unsay it." The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke the moment. George stepped back, his expression returning to formality just as Mrs. Cartwright appeared with a tray. "Forgive me, my lord," she said quickly. "I did not mean to interrupt." "There is nothing to forgive," he replied, his tone steady again. "Good night, Mrs. Evans." "Good night, my lord." And when he was gone, Clara sat down, her heart aching with a confusion she could no longer deny. She knew the world would never allow what her heart began to feel, yet every glance, every word drew her deeper into an affection that defied all sense. Down the hall, Lady Eleanor stood by the stairwell, having heard just enough of their voices to confirm her fears. Her hands, gloved in silk, tightened around the banister. "So it begins," she whispered to herself. The next morning, the house felt colder, though the fires burned as brightly as ever. The dowager took her breakfast alone, her expression serene, her mind already weaving plans to protect the name that meant everything to her. Clara, unaware of the storm gathering around her, walked through the snowy garden with Samuel, his laughter bright against the hush of winter. For a fleeting moment she allowed herself to believe that peace might last, that perhaps kindness could exist without consequence. But inside, behind the curtained windows, Lady Eleanor watched, her eyes narrowing. "This cannot stand," she murmured. And within the heart of Wintermere Hall, the fragile happiness that had bloomed like a flower in frost began to tremble under the weight of duty and pride. For even love, when born in secret, must someday face the light. The winter morning dawned grey and silent over Wintermere Hall, with a cold so sharp it seemed to pierce the air itself. A fine layer of frost covered the gardens like powdered silver, and the stillness outside felt almost sacred. Yet inside the house, the peace was deceptive, the kind of stillness that comes before the breaking of a fragile calm. Clara Evans sat by the window of the small chamber she now called her own, her hands folded on her lap. Though the fire burned low, she felt no warmth. The weight of Lady Eleanor's presence had altered the air of the house, tightening every breath, dimming every smile. It had been only 2 days since the Dowager's arrival, yet already the hall felt colder, more rigid, as though even its walls remembered fear. Clara tried to focus on her sewing, but her thoughts betrayed her. Her every memory of the Christmas ball returned to her in flashes. The Marquis's voice, his gaze, the quiet reverence of his touch as they danced beneath the candlelight. It had been a moment she could not forget, though she had spent every hour since reminding herself that she must. A knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. Cartwright, holding a tray with a cup of tea and a gentle smile. "You should drink something hot, dear. You look pale." "Thank you," Clara said softly, rising to take it. "I am well, truly. I suppose I did not sleep much." Mrs. Cartwright hesitated. "It's the Lady Dowager, isn't it? She has a way of turning a warm house cold with a single glance." Clara shook her head, unwilling to speak ill of the Marquis's mother. "She only protects what she loves. I cannot fault her for that." The older woman studied her for a moment as if weighing her heart. "You're a good soul, Mrs. Evans. Too good, perhaps. But take care. Goodness can wound as easily as it heals." When she left, the silence returned, thicker than before. Clara sat down again, staring at the grey horizon through the frosted glass. Somewhere in the distance, bells tolled faintly from the village church, a sound of devotion and longing that made her chest tighten. Downstairs, in the Marquis's study, George Pembroke stood at his desk, surrounded by papers he had not touched in hours. His mother's words still echoed through his mind, heavy and relentless. "This attachment, George," she had said that morning, her tone cutting though wrapped in civility, "will destroy you. The world does not forgive weakness, and affection for a woman beneath you is weakness, no matter how virtuous she may seem." "I ask for no forgiveness from the world," he had answered evenly, though his hands trembled. "You will when it turns its back on you," she replied. "You have a name to preserve, lands to maintain, responsibilities that go beyond your heart's inclinations." He had said nothing after that, but the battle within him had begun. Now, as he stared at the blank sheet before him, the fire crackling low, he realized he could no longer endure silence. He could not let her believe she had imagined everything, the warmth between them, the trust, the awakening he himself could not deny. And so he began to write. His pen moved quickly, as if guided by something greater than will. "My dearest Mrs. Evans, there are truths a man of my standing should never confess, yet I find myself incapable of concealing them. Since you entered this house, you have changed it, and me, in ways I cannot fully name. The laughter of your child has filled the halls with life again, but it is your presence that has restored light to my heart. You must know that you are not here out of charity. You are here because, without realizing it, I began to need your company as one needs air and warmth. I cannot ask you to remain where you do not feel safe, yet I cannot imagine Wintermere without you. If society should call me a fool, so be it. Better a fool for love than a coward in his own heart." He paused, his breath shallow, the ink still glistening on the page. The words seemed both impossible and inevitable. Folding the letter carefully, he sealed it with wax and pressed his family crest into the soft red seal. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine her face when she read it, the tremor in her hands, the warmth in her eyes. "Bennet," he called to his butler. The older man appeared promptly. "My lord, see that this letter is delivered to Mrs. Evans this evening," George said. "No one else is to touch it." "Yes, my lord. But fate, with its cruel precision, had other plans. Bennet had scarcely stepped into the corridor when he encountered Lady Eleanor ascending the staircase. Her gaze fell upon the letter at once. "What is that?" "A letter from his lordship, my lady. To be delivered—" "To whom?" she interrupted, her tone like ice. The butler hesitated. "To Mrs. Evans." Her eyes darkened. "Give it to me." He froze, uncertain. "My lady, I was instructed—" She lifted her chin. "By your master's mother, sir. Or would you prefer I inform him that his own household defies me?" Bennet faltered. "I meant no disrespect, my lady." "Then hand it over." When the letter touched her gloved fingers, she knew instinctively that it was dangerous, not because of what it said, but because of what it could mean. She carried it to her own room, locked the door, and broke the seal with a trembling hand. As she read, her lips tightened. Each word confirmed her worst fear, that her son had given his heart to a woman she deemed unworthy of his name. When she finished, she stared at the fire for a long while, the letter trembling in her grasp. At last, she fed it to the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "I will not let him ruin himself," she whispered. "Not for her." That evening, Clara waited in her chamber, long after the household had gone to sleep. She did not know what she expected. Perhaps a word from the Marquis, perhaps nothing at all, yet her heart refused rest. She thought she heard footsteps in the corridor once or twice, but no one came. By midnight she sat by the dying fire, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The storm outside had returned, wind howling across the moors, rattling the windows. Samuel slept soundly, his breathing steady, unaware of the restlessness that tormented his mother. In her heart, Clara sensed that something had shifted. The air in the house felt different, heavier, as though unseen walls had been built around her. When she had crossed paths with Lady Eleanor earlier that afternoon, the dowager's tone had been polite, her smile fixed, but her eyes had held a glint of triumph Clara could not understand. Downstairs in the study, George paced before the fire. Hours had passed, yet no reply had come. He imagined her reading his words, imagined the stillness that would follow. Perhaps she was shocked, perhaps she was afraid, or perhaps she had already decided to leave, and silence was her answer. He sank into the chair behind his desk, exhaustion overtaking him. "Fool," he murmured to himself, "you have overstepped the only line that still held your world together." In her room, Clara finally rose and crossed to the window. The snow had stopped. The moon, pale and distant, broke through a veil of clouds, casting the valley in a faint ghostly glow. She pressed her palm to the glass and whispered, "Thank you, my lord, for the kindness you have shown me. It must end here." Her voice broke. "Before it becomes something I cannot control." In another wing of the house, Lady Eleanor watched the same moon from her own window. The fire beside her burned low, but the faint scent of smoke still carried the last traces of the Marquis's letter. "You will thank me one day," she said aloud, though her reflection in the glass looked older, wearier. "You will see I saved you." But deep down, a whisper of doubt stirred. A voice that asked if perhaps she had not saved him at all, but doomed him instead. The next morning, Clara descended to breakfast with Samuel. The Marquis was not there. Lady Eleanor greeted her with poised civility, her tone like fine porcelain, delicate, cold, and unbreakable. "My son has gone riding," she said, lifting her cup of tea. "He wished for solitude this morning." Clara inclined her head. "I understand." "I'm sure you do," the dowager replied, and smiled in a way that made Clara's heart sink. When she left the table, she returned to her room and closed the door quietly behind her. She sat at her small writing desk and began a letter of her own, a short, trembling note of gratitude and farewell. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft as feathers, erasing all traces of the path that led to Wintermere. And somewhere between two hearts that longed for each other, a letter that might have changed everything had already turned to ashes. Its words lost to smoke, its truth swallowed by silence. Yet even in that silence the longing endured. For love, once awakened, cannot be undone by fire, nor erased by pride. It waits, patient, unyielding, in the shadows of the heart, where even absence cannot destroy it. The first days of the new year came with a brittle, unforgiving cold. The snow around Wintermere Hall no longer sparkled beneath sunlight. It had hardened into ice, pale and sharp, as if the very land had grown tired of softness. The festive warmth that had once filled the great house after Christmas had vanished, leaving behind an uneasy silence that lingered like an echo of something lost. Clara Evans moved quietly through the corridors, her hands folded before her, her gaze lowered whenever she crossed paths with a servant. She felt eyes upon her constantly now, polite, measured, but watching. The change was unmistakable. Since the Dowager Marchioness's arrival, everything within those walls had shifted. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Invitations to tea or lessons with Samuel were spoken with formality rather than kindness. The once lively house had become a gallery of whispers. She told herself it did not matter, that her stay was always meant to be temporary, that she was only waiting for the roads to clear, for her son's health to strengthen enough to make the journey back to their village. Yet every time she folded Samuel's clothes or packed away their few belongings, her hands faltered. The thought of leaving made her heart ache in ways she could not reason with. For in every corner of the house she saw George Pembroke. His presence lingered in the faint scent of cedar and smoke, in the weight of footsteps she could almost hear when all was still. And yet, she had not spoken to him properly since the night of the Christmas ball. He had become distant. At first, she told herself it was circumstance, his duties, his mother, the estate. But as the days passed and he failed to seek her out, doubt crept into her heart like cold into unguarded rooms. Had she imagined the warmth between them, the unspoken tenderness? Had the Marquis, proud, kind, complicated, come to regret his generosity? One morning, unable to bear the uncertainty, she sought refuge in the library. It was her favorite place in the house, a room filled with quiet intelligence, smelling faintly of leather and age. She found it empty, the fire low but burning. She moved between the shelves, brushing her fingers along the spines of books she had only dared admire from afar. She stopped when her eyes caught a single object on the desk, a small silver seal, still faintly stained with wax. She frowned. Something about it stirred a strange familiarity in her chest. When she reached for it, Mrs. Cartwright's voice interrupted softly from the doorway. "Mrs. Evans, my dear, you should not linger here. His lordship prefers to work in solitude." Clara startled slightly. "Forgive me. I did not mean to intrude." The housekeeper smiled kindly, though her eyes held sorrow. "No need to apologize. It seems solitude has become a companion to many of us these days." Clara hesitated before asking, Have you seen the Marquis today?" Mrs. Cartwright shook her head. "He has kept to his study since early morning. The Dowager visited him there not long ago. I imagine they are discussing matters of the estate." Clara's heart sank. "Of course," she murmured. "He must have much to attend." Mrs. Cartwright touched her arm gently. "Do not let pride silence what kindness cannot undo, Mrs. Evans. Sometimes the truth must be spoken, even if it trembles on the tongue." When she left the room, Clara lingered for a long time by the fire, lost in thought. Meanwhile, in his study, George Pembroke sat behind his desk, his pen idle above a page half written. His mother's words from earlier still hung heavy in the air between them. "You have allowed sentiment to rule your actions," Lady Eleanor had said, her tone sharp as frost. "Whatever affection you think you feel for that woman, it must end. You will destroy not only yourself, but her. The world is not kind to women who climb above their place." "I have never sought to harm her," he replied quietly. "Then spare her the pain of scandal," she answered. "End this before it begins." After she left, George had sat in silence for hours, the weight of her words pressing upon him. Every instinct of honor, every teaching of his lineage demanded that he obey. Yet his heart rebelled. He rose and paced before the window. Outside, snow drifted gently against the glass. He thought of Clara, her quiet strength, her courage, the way her laughter had softened the house, the tenderness she showed even to those who judged her. He longed to go to her, to speak the truth she deserved, but he could not offer her the life she would be forced to endure if the world turned against them both. By late afternoon, Clara decided to take Samuel for a walk in the garden. The child, wrapped in a thick wool coat, clutched her hand eagerly as they stepped into the crisp, silent air. The lake was frozen, the trees dusted with frost. "Look, Mama," Samuel said, his cheeks pink from the cold. "It sparkles like glass." "Yes, my love," she said softly, "but we must not step on it. Beauty can be fragile." From a distance, someone watched, unseen behind the tall windows of the east wing. George stood there, his gaze following them as they crossed the snow-covered lawn. Something inside him twisted painfully. He longed to go to them, to walk beside them, to feel her laughter warm the air again. But instead, he turned away. That evening, the Marquis joined his mother for supper. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, but the atmosphere was cold. "You seem distracted, my son," Lady Eleanor said, cutting her pheasant delicately. "I am merely tired," he replied. "You've been tired since that woman arrived," she said calmly. "Perhaps rest will find you once she is gone." He set his knife down sharply. "Enough, Mother. Mrs. Evans has done nothing to warrant your cruelty." "Cruelty?" she echoed. "No, George. I speak only of consequence. She does not belong in this world, and the longer she remains, the deeper her humiliation will be. Send her away while you still can." He pushed his chair back and stood. "If I send her away, it will not be for your satisfaction. It will be to protect her from the world you so fear." When he left the room, Lady Eleanor's composure faltered. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, whispering to herself, "Better his anger now than his ruin later." In the days that followed, the silence between George and Clara grew unbearable. They saw each other only in passing, a nod in the corridor, a faint smile across a room neither dared to cross. Each glance carried more weight than words could hold, and each unspoken feeling cut deeper than any open wound. One evening, Clara found herself in the music room. The piano sat untouched in the corner, its ivory keys gleaming faintly in the candlelight. She lifted the lid and touched one key softly. The sound was tender, melancholic, like a memory she could not escape. She began to play, her fingers uncertain at first, then sure. The melody that filled the air was gentle, fragile, filled with yearning. George, walking down the corridor, stopped when he heard it. The notes drifted through the air like a prayer. He followed them, his heart pounding, until he reached the doorway. Clara did not see him at first. Her eyes were closed, her lips parted slightly as if she were breathing through the music. He stood there, motionless, afraid to break the spell. When she finally looked up, she startled, then rose quickly, her hands trembling. "Forgive me, my lord. I did not realize anyone was near." "Please," he said softly, stepping forward, "do not stop. It is the first sound of life this house has known in years." She hesitated. "It was a foolish indulgence." "Then let us be foolish together," he replied, his tone almost tender. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and for a moment all the distance between them vanished. The longing, the restraint, the words left unsaid, all of it shimmered in the silence. "I have missed your voice," he said quietly, "and your laughter." Her breath caught. "My lord, you must not—" "I must," he interrupted, his voice trembling with emotion. "Because if I do not speak now, I may never forgive myself. You have filled this place with warmth I thought was lost forever. Every day you are here, I fight a battle I know I cannot win. You ask for nothing, yet I would give you everything." Tears rose in her eyes. "Do not say such things, my lord. You do not mean them." "I mean every word." She turned away, clutching the edge of the piano for strength. "You cannot. The world you belong to would never forgive what your heart desires. Then let the world be damned," he said, his voice low and fierce. For a heartbeat, they stood only inches apart, the air alive between them. His hand hovered near hers, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. But he did not touch her. The restraint was agony, but also reverence. Finally, she whispered, "You must not make promises you cannot keep." He closed his eyes, as if in pain. "Perhaps you are right." When he opened them again, his expression was gentler, filled with sorrow. "Forgive me," he said. "You deserve peace, not scandal." He turned and left the room before she could speak, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Clara remained where she was, the melody still trembling in the air, her heart breaking silently beneath the weight of everything they had not said. That night, the snow began to fall again, thick, heavy, endless, covering the grounds of Wintermere Hall like a shroud. Within its walls, two souls lay awake in separate rooms, each whispering the same truth into the darkness, that love, though forbidden, had already taken root, and no force of pride or propriety could erase it now. The snow had ceased at last, but the world outside Wintermere Hall lay buried beneath its weight. Every path was hidden, every hedge crowned in white, and the air hung heavy with that strange stillness that follows a storm. The pale morning light filtered through the tall windows, soft and uncertain, as though even the sun dared not intrude upon the silence that had fallen within the house. Clara Evans stood by her window, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. From her room in the north wing, she could see the distant stables where grooms moved like shadows in the mist. She had slept little. The conversation in the music room echoed endlessly in her mind, the Marquis's voice trembling with sincerity, the heat in his eyes, the anguish that followed his confession. She could still feel the nearness of him, the unspoken promise that had burned between them. And yet she knew it could not be. The world to which he belonged was one of elegance and expectation, while hers had been shaped by simplicity and struggle. Whatever bond existed between them was a fragile miracle born of winter's isolation, destined to fade when the snow melted. She had learned long ago that love, true, reckless love, was not a luxury meant for her. Downstairs, George Pembroke, the Marquis of Wintermere, stood before the fireplace in his study, his face pale with exhaustion. He had not slept either. His mother's warnings still haunted him, but so did Clara's voice, gentle, wounded, wise. Every word she spoke seemed to draw him closer to something he had spent years denying, the possibility of redemption, not through status or inheritance, but through the quiet strength of a woman who asked nothing of him except honesty. The flames before him crackled, casting shadows across the walls. His reflection in the tall window looked older than he remembered, a man divided between duty and longing. He pressed his hand against the cool glass and whispered to the empty room, "If I had been born a different man, I would not hesitate." When he finally left his study, the corridors were still. Only the faint scent of baking bread from the kitchen hinted at life beyond the walls. He made his way toward the schoolroom, where he knew Clara often spent the morning hours with her son. He stopped at the doorway, watching quietly. Clara sat at the table beside Samuel, who was bent over a small slate, tracing letters with his finger. Her voice was low and warm, her patience endless. The light from the window fell upon her hair, turning it to copper and gold, and for a moment George felt as though he were looking upon something sacred. When she noticed him, she rose at once. "My lord," she said, her voice composed though her heart faltered, "you honor us with your presence." Please," he said gently, "do not rise on my account." But she had already done so, the barrier of formality firmly restored between them. Samuel looked up, his eyes bright. "Good morning, my lord." George smiled faintly. "Good morning, young sir. And what great learning occupies you today?" The boy beamed. Mamma says I'm learning to write my name. Look." He held up the slate proudly. The letters were shaky but legible. George bent down to examine it, his smile softening. "You are a fast learner. Your mother must be very proud." "She is," Samuel said earnestly. "She says words can open doors." The Marquis glanced at Clara. Wise advice indeed. When the boy returned to his work, George straightened. "Mrs. Evans, may I have a word?" She hesitated. "Of course, my lord." He gestured toward the hallway, and she followed him out. They walked in silence until they reached the gallery overlooking the gardens. The snow reflected so much light that the room seemed to glow. Clara folded her hands tightly before her. "My lord," she began softly, "if this is about yesterday—" "It is," he said, cutting her off gently. "But not in the way you think." She kept her gaze on the window. "Then what would you have me hear?" He drew a slow breath. "I have wrestled with every word I spoke to you. I know what the world would say of me, that a marquis should not concern himself with the affections of a widow of modest means. But what the world does not understand is that for the first time in years I feel something alive within me, something real." Her throat tightened. "My lord, please, let me finish," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You have brought light into this house, Clara. You have brought warmth where there was only silence. I cannot explain how or why, but every day I find myself looking for you, in the sound of your voice, in the laughter of your son, in every quiet corner of this hall." She turned to face him then, her eyes glistening. "You speak as though such feelings could exist without consequence, but they cannot. Your kindness will become my ruin, and yours as well." He took a hesitant step toward her. "And yet, knowing that, I cannot silence my heart." Her voice quivered. "You must try." "Do you wish me to?" She looked at him, unable to answer. The intensity in his gaze threatened to undo her completely. "Say the word," he whispered. "Tell me to forget you, and I will try with all that is left of me." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The silence between them was a living thing, fragile, aching, infinite. Finally she closed her eyes. "You know I cannot." He exhaled, a sound half relief, half despair. For a moment neither moved. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. His glove brushed her fingers, and the contact sent a shock through them both. "Forgive me," he murmured, his voice raw. "I should not. Do not ask forgiveness for what you have not done," she said softly. "There is nothing to forgive." He looked at her as though he were seeing her for the first time. "You are remarkable, Clara Evans. And you," she whispered, "are a man I should never have known." Before either could speak again, a sound echoed from down the corridor, the sharp click of heels against marble. They stepped apart instantly as Lady Eleanor Pembroke appeared at the far end of the gallery, her expression unreadable. "George," she said, her voice calm but laced with meaning. "A word, if you please." "Of course," he said, regaining his composure. "Mrs. Evans, we will speak again." She curtsied slightly, her heart pounding, and turned away. As she disappeared into the next room, she heard the dowager's cold voice behind her. "You are playing a dangerous game, my son." George's reply was low, controlled. "It is not a game." "No," Lady Eleanor said, her tone icy. "It is a mistake, one that will cost you dearly if you do not end it now." When Clara reached her chamber, she pressed her back against the door, trying to steady her breathing. She could still feel the warmth of his hand on hers, still hear his voice. "Say the word, and I will try to forget you." She knew she should have said it. She knew she should have severed the thread that tied them before it bound her completely. But she could not. That evening, as dusk fell over the frozen hills, Clara went to the chapel on the edge of the estate. It was small and simple, its stone walls worn by years of wind and prayer. Inside, candlelight flickered over the altar, casting gentle shadows. She knelt in the front pew, her hands clasped tightly, her tears falling silently. "Lord," she whispered, "give me the strength to do what is right. not what my heart desires." The door creaked softly behind her. She turned and froze. George stood there, his face pale, his eyes full of sorrow. "I thought I might find you here," he said quietly. She rose, wiping her eyes. "My lord, you should not—" "Please," he said, stepping closer. "No titles, not tonight. Only George." Her lips trembled. "Then I must be Clara." "Clara," he said, her name like a prayer on his tongue. "You once told me that hope carries us through the darkest hours. But what of the heart that finds light and is told to turn away from it?" "The heart," she whispered, "must still obey the soul." He moved closer, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel his breath, warm and unsteady. And what if the soul cannot find peace without the heart? She looked up at him, her tears glistening in the candlelight. "Then it must learn to suffer." He closed his eyes, as if the words had struck him. "I do not want to bring suffering to your door." "You already have," she said softly, "but not in the way you think." For a long moment they stood in silence, the candles flickering around them, the faint scent of wax and stone filling the air. Then, with infinite gentleness, he reached out and brushed his thumb against her cheek, wiping away a tear. "Clara," he murmured, "I swear I never meant for this to happen." "I know," she said, her voice breaking, "and that is why it hurts." Their eyes met, his filled with longing, hers with resignation, and in that gaze every unspoken word between them was laid bare. Outside, the wind began to rise again, sweeping across the frozen fields. Inside the chapel, the candles trembled, their flames bending but not extinguished. George lowered his hand, stepping back through every fibre of his being resisted it. "I will find a way," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I do not yet know how, but I will." Clara shook her head. "You cannot fight the world, my lord, it will crush us both." "Then let it," he whispered. "I would rather fall with you than live without you." She turned away, unable to bear the intensity of his words. "Please," she said, "go before we both forget ourselves." He hesitated, his heart breaking in his chest, then bowed his head. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, my lord." When he left, she sank to her knees once more, her tears falling freely. The wind outside howled through the chapel's old beams, like a lament for all the love the world would not allow. And though both hearts tried to silence what they felt, the truth lingered, quiet, steadfast, unyielding, like the last flame of a candle that refuses to die, no matter how fierce the storm. The final days of winter arrived with a fragile kind of beauty, the kind that breaks the heart even as it soothes it. The fields beyond Wintermere Hall shimmered with frost, and the lake, still frozen, reflected a pale sun that barely rose above the hills. Inside the great house, silence had become both comfort and torment. Clara Evans felt that silence in her bones. Each morning she awoke to the sound of distant footsteps, the murmur of servants, the crackle of firelight. But none of it reached her heart anymore. Since that night in the chapel, she and the Marquis of Wintermere had spoken only in passing. Words that once flowed easily now caught in their throats, and their eyes met only long enough to reveal what neither dared to say aloud. The Dowager Marchioness moved through the house like a shadow of old propriety, ensuring every glance and whisper served her purpose. Her victory was quiet but complete. No confrontation had been needed. She had merely allowed silence to do what it always did best, to destroy what tenderness dared to exist in defiance of pride. Clara knew that the moment to leave was near. Samuel had regained his health, the roads were clear again, and spring waited beyond the horizon. Yet the thought of leaving made her heart tighten painfully. She stood often by the window, watching the thawing snow, wondering if love could survive when the world conspired to bury it. That morning, as she folded her son's small garments into a trunk, Mrs. Cartwright entered quietly. The older woman's eyes, kind but weary, studied the half-packed belongings. "So it's true, then," she said softly. "You mean to go?" Clara nodded without looking up. "It is time." "Does he know?" "No," Clara answered. "And he mustn't. It would only make parting harder. Mrs. Cartwright sighed. You have a good heart, my dear. Too good, perhaps. But hearts like yours change lives even when they break. Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered. He has given me more kindness than I ever hoped to know. That will have to be enough. Downstairs, George stood in his study, staring at the same letter he had written weeks before, the one that never reached her hands. He did not know it had been burned, only that it had vanished into silence. He had written others since, each folded and sealed, each one cast aside before he could summon the courage to send them. He was a man divided. Every fibre of his being longed to defy the world, to claim the woman who had reignited his spirit. Yet reason, cold, ancestral, relentless, reminded him that the weight of his name was not his alone to bear. Still, the thought of her leaving without a word filled him with a dread he could no longer ignore. By late afternoon, the house glowed with a thin, golden light as the sun began its slow descent. Clara walked through the long corridor leading to the library, her steps echoing softly. She had meant to leave a note for the Marquis, nothing more than gratitude in proper form, but fate, as ever, had other intentions. George was already there, standing by the tall windows, his back to her. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, surprise and something deeper flickering in his eyes. "Mrs. Evans," he said quietly, "I did not expect—" "I came to thank you, my lord," she interrupted gently, "for everything you have done. For my son, for your kindness, for the generosity you have shown." He frowned. "Thank me? That sounds like farewell." She lowered her gaze. "Because it is." For a moment the world stopped breathing. George took a slow step forward. "You cannot mean that." "I do," she whispered. "Samuel is strong again and the roads have cleared. We must return home." "Home," he repeated, his voice hollow. "You call that village your home now?" "It is all we have, my lord. And I would not overstay the mercy you have shown us." "Mercy," he said almost bitterly. "Is that what you think this has been?" Her lips trembled. "What else could it be?" He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. "Do you truly believe I opened my doors to you out of pity?" His voice was low, trembling not with anger but with anguish. "Clara, I have been a fool in many things, but not in what I feel for you." Her breath caught. "Please," she said, stepping back, "do not speak so." "I must," he said, "because silence has already cost us too much." She turned away, her hands clasped tightly before her. "We live in different worlds. I have seen what happens when people forget that truth. I will not see you condemned for kindness." He reached for her hand, gently, reverently, and she froze beneath his touch. "Condemned," he murmured. "If love is a crime, then I am guilty beyond redemption." Her tears broke then, falling silently. "You do not know what you are saying." He lifted her hand to his lips, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that since the day you came into this house, I have known no peace without you." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "You have responsibilities, a name, a mother who would see me destroyed before she allowed this." "Let her try," he said fiercely. "She can command the house, the servants, the fortune, but she cannot command my heart." His defiance both terrified and moved her. "My lord, please," she whispered. "You owe it to your family, to your father's memory." "I owe them nothing if it means living without truth," he said. Her strength faltered. "And what truth is that?" He stepped closer until only a breath separated them. "That I love you." The words fell into the quiet like snow upon still water, soft, inevitable, final. For a long moment, neither spoke. Her tears glimmered in the fading light, and his eyes searched hers with the desperate hope of a man who had finally found what he never dared seek. When she finally spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper. "You must not say such things. Love cannot erase the world around us." "Then let it defy it," he said, "even if only for this moment." His hand lingered at her cheek. Not a touch, but a confession. She closed her eyes, her breath trembling, and for one heartbeat time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then softly she pulled away. What you ask of me, my lord, is impossible. He closed his eyes, pain etched across his face. Why must what is right feel so much like punishment? Because we are human, she said gently, and the world was not built for hearts like ours. He turned from her then, unable to meet her gaze. The silence between them was unbearable, filled with all they had said and all they could never say. At last she moved toward the door. "Goodbye, my lord." Her voice trembled, but her steps did not. He turned sharply. "You would leave without a word of what this has meant to you." She paused, her back to him. "I would leave with gratitude, and with love I dare not speak." That was all. When she was gone, George sank into the nearest chair, his hands pressed to his face. The world outside the window blurred through his tears. He had fought wars of pride, of duty, of loss, but never one like this, never one that stripped him bare and left him longing for something as simple, as sacred as a life beside her. As dusk deepened into night, the snow began to fall again, slow and steady, blanketing the world in silence. Clara stood by the carriage in the courtyard, her shawl drawn close, her breath visible in the cold. Samuel climbed inside, clutching the small toy horse the Marquis had given him. She looked once more toward the great doors of Wintermere Hall, tall, imposing, and heartbreakingly still. No figure appeared. No voice called her name. She lifted her chin and stepped inside the carriage. As the wheels began to turn, she whispered to herself, "Thank you, my lord, for showing me that love still exists, even when it cannot be ours." Inside the hall, George stood by the window, watching the carriage disappear into the white distance. His mother entered the room silently. "She is gone," she said softly. He did not look at her. Yes, and with her, every piece of warmth this house ever knew. "Time will heal this, my son." He turned to face her then, his voice low but steady. "Time may silence grief, mother, but it will never silence love." That night, Wintermere Hall slept beneath a veil of snow. The fires burned low, the world held its breath, and in two distant hearts, one noble, one humble, love endured, not in defiance, but in devotion. And though their paths had parted beneath that endless winter sky, each carried the same vow unspoken. To love once, truly and wholly, even if the world forbade it, was to have lived completely. 8 years had passed since the long winter that had changed the course of so many lives. The snow that once buried Wintermere Hall had long melted into the soil, feeding the green fields that now stretched toward the distant hills. The great house still stood, solemn, proud, but softened by time. Its windows, once dark and shuttered, were now open to the sunlight, and laughter sometimes drifted from within, though fainter than before. The Marquis of Wintermere had aged, though not unkindly. George Pembroke's hair was streaked with silver now, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke not of bitterness, but of endurance. His mother, Lady Eleanor, had passed away 3 winters earlier, quietly, with the same unbending dignity that had marked her life. In her final days, she had sent for her son, taken his hand, and whispered words that had lingered ever since. "I see it now," she had said. "It was love, not defiance, and I mistook one for the other." She had left him not only her blessing, but also an emptiness that no inheritance could fill. Since then, George had lived between 2 worlds, one of nobility, duty, and expectation, and another of memory, of warmth, of a woman and a child who had once filled his home with laughter and light. He had never remarried, despite the subtle urgings of his peers. A marquis must secure his lineage, they said. But George had learned that love was not a matter of legacy. It was a wound and a miracle both, and some miracles were not meant to be repeated. Still, he had not been alone. Every spring, without fail, a letter arrived at Wintermere. The handwriting was neat but modest, the ink faded from travel. It was signed only C.E., but no seal was needed. Inside each envelope there were only a few words: updates about a boy's growth, the state of the village, the first blossoms after winter. They were simple notes, almost formal, yet each one carried the unmistakable rhythm of affection restrained by time and circumstance. He never replied in writing, yet each year he rode north to the small village of Alderbrook, where he would pause at the edge of the fields to watch from afar. There, among the wildflowers, he would see her, Clara Evans, still graceful, still quiet, her hair darker now, touched with only a hint of grey. Her son, no longer the frail child he once was, worked beside her, his shoulders strong, his laughter unburdened. On that spring morning, George watched again from a distance, his gloved hands resting on the reins of his horse. The wind carried the scent of lilacs, and the world was full of light. "She looks well," said a voice behind him. It was Mrs. Cartwright, older now, but still sturdy, who had insisted on accompanying him. "She's built a good life, my lord. The boy, too. He's apprenticed to the village physician, clever as his mother." George nodded, his eyes still fixed on the distant figure. "I know. I have made certain she has everything she needs." Mrs. Cartwright smiled faintly. "Without her ever knowing?" He said nothing for a long while. Then, softly, "She would not have accepted otherwise." They watched in silence as Clara lifted her face toward the sunlight. For a fleeting instant, it seemed she looked directly at him, though the distance between them was too great for certainty. Yet something in her stillness, in the tilt of her head, told him she knew. She always knew. When they rode back toward Wintermere that evening, the sky was streaked with gold and rose. "Do you ever regret it?" Mrs. Cartwright asked quietly. George's gaze wandered toward the horizon. To love her. Never. To lose her. Every day. The house welcomed them with its familiar hush. Inside, the portraits of his ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes solemn and unyielding. But on his desk, beside his mother's miniature and an old quill, lay a single object that no nobleman's heirloom could surpass. A small wooden horse, worn smooth by time, carved long ago by Samuel Evans as a child. George picked it up, his fingers tracing the faint initials scratched into its base. S.E. The boy's laughter seemed to echo in the memory of the hall. Later that night, as the moon climbed high, he walked to the terrace overlooking the valley. The gardens below shimmered with dew, and a soft breeze stirred the ivy that climbed the stone walls. He thought of Clara again, of the chapel where they had last spoken, of the words they had whispered between love and duty, of the promise neither had dared to make, but both had kept in their hearts. In a small cottage miles away, Clara stood by her window, the same moonlight spilling over her face. Her hands rested on the sill as she gazed at the distant hills, where Wintermere Hall stood like a memory carved into the land. Samuel slept peacefully in the next room. He was nearly a man now, strong, kind, wise beyond his years. He knew the Marquis by name but not by story, though sometimes Clara caught a glimmer in his eyes that reminded her of George's quiet strength. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for what might have been, but for what had endured. For 8 years had not dimmed the truth between them. Their love had not been erased by time or distance. It had simply changed form, like water freezing and melting, never lost, only transformed. It lived in kindness, in the lives they had touched, in the letters that crossed the miles between them. It lived in silence, in faith, and in memory. And somewhere deep within both hearts there remained the same unspoken vow, that should they ever meet again, even in the twilight of their years, no words would be needed. One glance would be enough to know that nothing, not pride, not time, not the cruel divide of the world, had ever truly parted them. The spring wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of lilacs and earth. It passed through the open windows of Wintermere Hall, through the quiet village of Alderbrook, and into the night. A whisper of love, still alive in the air. And though history would never speak their names together, the land remembered. The valley that had once held snow and sorrow now held peace. For love, they had learned, does not always ask to be seen. It only asks to remain, in the breath between seasons, in the light that returns after darkness, in the hearts of those who dared to love, even when the world said they should not. Every love story leaves a trace, a quiet echo that reminds us of who we are, what we long for, and what we sometimes must let go. The tale of Clara and the Marquis of Wintermere is not only about forbidden love, but about courage. The courage to feel deeply, even when the world tells you not to. It reminds us that some loves are not meant to be lived in palaces, but in hearts. That kindness can change destinies, that even distance cannot silence what is true, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is not to possess, but to protect. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe once again in love that endures beyond time, leave a comment below and tell me what moved you the most. And for those who reach the very end of this journey, write the word Wintermere in the comments, so I'll know you were here until the final heartbeat of this story. Your words mean more than you imagine. They remind us why we tell these stories. To keep romance, hope and emotion alive in a world that often forgets them. If you wish to support the team that brings these tales to life, you can send a super thanks on YouTube with whatever amount you feel moved to give. Every gesture, big or small, helps us continue creating worlds where love defies all odds. And if you cannot support us that way, don't worry. Sharing this video with someone who believes in love as much as you do is another beautiful way to help this story live on. Stay until the end, because I've left you links to other stories that carry the same heartbeat. Romances filled with longing, courage, and timeless devotion. Thank you, from the depths of my heart, for letting this story find a place in yours. May it remind you that even in the coldest winter, love always finds its spring.